Okay, we'll do a couple and then we go to the chief. Madam Chairman, I just want to say you did a fantastic job. What a beautiful evening, and we're going to reschedule. And after that, it's very tough for her to ask a killer question, right? But you have done a fantastic job. Please.
Mr. President, I appreciate it. As you mentioned, it all happened so quickly, and I wonder, especially because unfortunately you have experience with these sorts of threats, in that moment when you realized there was a threat and service agents were telling us to get down, can you describe what was going through your mind, how you were feeling in that moment?
That's a very good question, actually. It's always shocking when something like this happens. It's happened to me a little bit, and that never changes. The fact, we were sitting right next to each other, the First Lady on my right, and I heard a noise and sort of thought it was a tray. I thought it was a tray going down. I've heard that many times, and it was a pretty loud noise. And it was from quite far away. He hadn't reached the area.
It's a Saturday night in Washington, D.C. The most powerful people in America are gathered in one room. The President of the United States, the Vice President, the Secretary of State, the FBI Director, and nearly 2,600 others, dressed in black tie, laughing, clinking glasses. The atmosphere is electric. For the first time in years, the sitting president has agreed to attend the most famous media dinner in the world. No one in that ballroom has any idea that just outside, a man is walking through the lobby of the Washington Hilton, calm, focused, and armed with a shotgun, a handgun, and multiple knives. What happens in the next 25 seconds will shock the nation. Washington, D.C. had been buzzing for weeks. The annual White House Correspondents Dinner, nicknamed the Nerd Prom by those who attended every year, was back, and this time it carried a weight it hadn't carried in years. Because this year, for the first time since returning to the Oval Office, President Donald Trump had agreed to show up. That alone made history. During his entire first term, Trump had refused to attend. He had no love for the press corps, and the feeling was mutual. The dinner, traditionally a light-hearted evening where the president jokes at his own expense, alongside journalists and celebrities, had always felt to Trump like walking into enemy territory. So he stayed away. Every single year, he stayed away. But 2026 was different. Perhaps it was confidence, perhaps it was a statement, or perhaps it was something simpler, a man in the second chapter of his presidency deciding it was time to face the room. Whatever the reason, the announcement that Trump would attend sent shockwaves through Washington's social calendar. Tickets became even more coveted than usual. The guest list read like a who's who of American power. Vice President J.D. Vance would be there, FBI Director Kash Patel, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin, Senior White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt. The list went on and on. The venue, as always, was the Washington Hilton, a sprawling, grand hotel on Connecticut Avenue that had hosted this dinner for decades. What most of the guests probably didn't pause to think about as they stepped out of their limousines and town cars was a chilling piece of history attached to that very building. 45 years earlier, on March 30, 1981, a young man named John Hinckley Jr. had stood outside the same hotel and fired 6 shots at President Ronald Reagan as he walked to his motorcade. Reagan was hit. He nearly died. The Washington Hilton had seen an assassination attempt before, and it was about to see something terrifyingly close to one again. Security for the evening was, by any measure, extraordinary. Former FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe would later describe it as almost on the level of a national security event. The concentration of senior government officials under one roof had triggered a massive coordination effort between the Secret Service and partner agencies in the weeks leading up to the dinner. Metal detector screening areas, magnetometers, had been set up near the entrance to the ballroom. Agents were stationed throughout the hotel. The perimeter had been assessed and reassessed. On paper, this was one of the most secure civilian gatherings in the country. But there was a complication. that nobody could fully eliminate. The Washington Hilton is not a private venue. It is a functioning hotel open to the public. And on the night of April 25, 2026, while the most powerful people in America dined inside the ballroom, the broader lobby of the hotel remained accessible to other guests, people who had booked rooms, people who had checked in for an ordinary Saturday night stay. The Associated Press would later note that security screening was positioned closer to the ballroom itself, not at the outermost perimeter of the building. That gap, small, logistical, seemingly unremarkable, would matter enormously before the night was over. Inside the ballroom, the mood was celebratory. The evening's entertainment was mentalist Oz Perlman, and the crowd of roughly 2,600 guests had settled in for what promised to be a memorable night. Journalists mingled with politicians. Television anchors chatted with cabinet secretaries. CNN anchor Wolf Blitzer was there. Fox News anchor Brett Baier was there. Photographers moved between tables, capturing the rare spectacle of Washington's media world and its political world occupying the same space, at the same time, with something approaching goodwill. It is worth noting, however, that not everyone felt that warmth. Outside the hotel, protesters had gathered. Some held signs. One sign read simply, "Journalism is dead." Before the dinner had even begun, 500 journalists had signed a petition urging the White House Correspondents Association to take a harder stand against what they described as the Trump administration's efforts to trample freedom of the press. The WHCA president, CBS News journalist Weijia Jiang, had tried to strike a conciliatory tone, telling reporters, "I don't think people realize how closely we are working with the White House." But the tension was there, simmering just beneath the surface of the evening's carefully curated festivity. Inside, none of that tension was visible. Trump sat at the head table on the stage, a position of honor, a position of visibility. Melania Trump was beside him. The room hummed with conversation, the clink of cutlery, the low roar of 2,600 people all talking at once. It was, by every outward appearance, a perfect Washington evening. At 8:40 p.m. Eastern Time, dinner was being served. And then, just outside that ballroom, something went wrong. Near the main magnetometer screening area, the security checkpoint that stood between the hotel's accessible lobby space and the restricted area closer to the ballroom, a man appeared. He had been staying at the hotel. He had a room key. He was a guest, just like dozens of other ordinary visitors who had nothing to do with the dinner. But he was not ordinary, and what he was carrying was anything but a shotgun, a handgun, multiple knives. He approached the checkpoint. Security confronted him, and then, rather than stopping, rather than complying, rather than doing anything a rational person would do when faced with armed federal agents, he ran. He blew past the checkpoint. And he opened fire. The sound of gunshots cracked through the lobby of the Washington Hilton like a thunderclap. Inside the ballroom, Brett Baier heard it from his seat, loud, unmistakable, clearly not part of the evening's program. He would later tell viewers that the shots did not appear to come from inside the ballroom itself, but the sound was close enough to be deeply alarming. Outside the ballroom, Wolf Blitzer was only a few feet away from the gunman when it happened. In one of the most extraordinary eyewitness accounts of any security incident in recent American history, Blitzer would later describe watching a man fire what he called a very serious weapon, not once, not twice, but at least 6 times. A police officer, moving fast, threw Blitzer to the ground. Agents rushed him into a nearby restroom for cover. Blitzer, a veteran journalist who had covered wars, disasters, and the September 11th attacks, was shaken in a way that few things had ever shaken him. The shooter was tackled, taken to the ground, apprehended. The entire incident, from the moment he ran past the checkpoint to the moment he was subdued, lasted approximately 25 seconds. 25 seconds that changed everything about that Saturday night. Inside the ballroom, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Several Secret Service agents shouted, "Shots fired," the 2 words that in any security context trigger the most hardwired responses in the human body. Fight, flight, freeze. 2,600 people, most of them journalists and politicians with no security training whatsoever, suddenly had to process the fact that there was an active shooter in the building. Many dove under their tables. Some began to chant, "God bless America." The voices rose, ragged and trembling, from beneath the tablecloths. Others chanted, "USA." Others simply pulled out their phones and started filming, because journalists, even terrified ones, document. On the stage at the head table, President Trump was surrounded in seconds. Secret Service agents closed around him like a wall of bodies. Armed guards in full tactical gear, carrying rifles, appeared on the dais. And then Trump was moving off the stage, away from the ballroom, into a secure area within the hotel, guided by the same instincts and training that the Secret Service had spent months preparing for. He fought to stay. He would say so himself later that night. Standing at the White House briefing room podium just 2 hours after the shooting, he told reporters, "I fought like hell to stay, but law enforcement had made the call. Protocol was protocol." And so, the President of the United States was moved to safety. Melania Trump was evacuated. Vice President Vance was evacuated. White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt was evacuated. Cabinet members were hustled into secure holding areas within the hotel. Senators and Congress members were seen departing on foot into the Washington night, including Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island and Representative Jared Moskowitz of Florida, walking quickly, heads down, the formal evening shattered around them. Among the guests being escorted out, one detail stood out in the chaos. Erica Kirk, the widow of conservative commentator Charlie Kirk, was seen being led away from the venue in tears. It was that kind of night. One law enforcement officer had been shot. The bullet had struck him directly, but he was wearing a bullet-resistant vest. The vest held. He survived. Trump, when he spoke about it later, said he was saved by the fact that he was wearing, obviously, a very good bulletproof vest. The vest did the job. One sentence, 3 words of relief buried inside a night of terror. By approximately 9:45 p.m., Trump departed the Washington Hilton entirely, motorcading back to the White House as law enforcement declared the venue a crime scene. WHCA President Weijia Jiang returned to the stage before the full clearance, trying to hold the evening together, announcing that Trump planned to address the nation from the White House and that the dinner would be rescheduled within 30 days. Her voice was steady. Her hands, those who were close enough to see, were not. Outside, in the lobby where 25 seconds had upended an entire evening, investigators had already begun their work. A hotel room had been secured. A perimeter had been established. The suspect was in custody, being transported to a local hospital, not because he had been shot, but because he needed to be medically evaluated. And somewhere in that chaos, a question was beginning to form in the minds of every agent, every investigator, every journalist who had just lived through it. Who was he? And why had he come here tonight? The suspect was alive. That was the first thing investigators confirmed as the dust began to settle on what had just happened inside the Washington Hilton. He had not been killed in the confrontation. He had not taken his own life. He was breathing, conscious, and in custody, which meant that for the first time since the shots rang out, law enforcement had something more valuable than a crime scene. They had a person to question. His name, as it would emerge in the hours that followed through a combination of federal briefings and media leaks, was Cole Tomas Allen, 31 years old, a resident of Torrance, California, a quiet, unremarkable suburb of Los Angeles, the kind of place where neighbors wave from driveways and nobody expects their street to end up on national television. By midnight, it was on every screen in America. FBI agents had already assembled outside a home linked to Allen in Torrance. Police tape went up along part of the street. A spotlight was trained on the windows of the property. News helicopters circled overhead, their cameras feeding live footage to networks that were rapidly rebuilding their Saturday night programming around a single stunning story. A next-door neighbor, speaking to CNN but declining to be identified, said something that would stick with people who heard it. He said he didn't see Allen often, but he had been there just a couple of days ago. And then, almost as an afterthought, the neighbor added that Allen's father was friendly, chatty, even, the kind of man you'd stop and talk to on the sidewalk. Normal, everything about it sounded so completely, disturbingly normal. And yet, the more investigators and journalists dug into the life of Cole Tomas Allen, the more a portrait emerged that was both surprising and, in hindsight, quietly unsettling. Allen was not, by any conventional measure, someone you would look at and see danger. He was educated, impressively so. He had studied engineering at the California Institute of Technology, known to most people simply as Caltech, one of the most prestigious scientific institutions in the world. A Caltech degree is not something handed to anyone. It requires a particular kind of mind, disciplined, analytical, capable of holding complex systems together in careful order. After Caltech, Allen had built what looked from the outside like a modest but respectable life. He worked as a teacher. His LinkedIn profile, which investigators and journalists were combing through within hours of his name becoming public, described him as a mechanical engineer and computer scientist by degree. Independent game developer by experience, teacher by birth. There was something almost poetic about the way he had written it, as though he was a man who had genuinely thought about his identity and how he wanted the world to see him. In December 2024, just 16 months before the shooting, Allen had been named Teacher of the Month by the Torrance branch of C2 Education, a national private tutoring and test preparation company for college-bound students. A Facebook post, apparently linked to his account, had celebrated the recognition. Someone had taken the time to acknowledge him, to say, "You are doing something good here." He had also, in quieter hours, been building video games. His LinkedIn noted that he had published an indie game called Birdom on the Steam gaming platform, available for purchase at $1.99. He had registered a trademark for the name back in 2018, and he was, according to his own profile, working on a second game working title, First Law. A teacher, a game developer, a Caltech graduate, a man who received awards and built things and had a father the neighbors liked to talk to. And a man who had walked into the Washington Hilton on a Saturday night carrying a shotgun, a handgun, and multiple knives, with what law enforcement would later confirm was a clear and stated purpose. He had told investigators he was there to assassinate officials from the Trump administration. That detail, quietly confirmed by authorities in the hours after the arrest, reframed everything. This was not a random act of violence. It was not a mental health crisis that had simply exploded in a public space without direction or target. It was, by the suspect's own admission, a politically motivated assassination attempt. The man had a plan. He had a destination. He had armed himself, traveled across the country, checked into the very hotel where the most powerful people in America would be gathered, and waited. Political thread, thin as it was, began to unravel in the press almost immediately. Records showed that Allen had made a $25 donation to a Democratic Party Political Action Committee in support of Kamala Harris during the 2024 presidential election. It was a small amount, the kind of donation that speaks more to sentiment than to deep partisan commitment. But in the context of what had just happened, every detail was being examined under a microscope. Trump himself, standing at the White House briefing room podium just hours after being evacuated from the dinner, was asked directly, did he believe he was the target? He paused. And then, with the particular economy of language he tends to deploy when a situation is still unfolding and certainty is out of reach, he said simply, "I guess." He called Allen a lone wolf. He praised the Secret Service. He said the information about the shooter's motivations would come out in the coming days. And then he added something that, given what had just been averted, carried an almost surreal quality. He said he wanted to reschedule the dinner within 30 days. The arraignment was set for Monday. The charges, as announced by U.S. Attorney Jean Pirro, were stark: using a firearm during a crime of violence and assault on a federal officer using a dangerous weapon. More charges, Pirro made clear, were likely to follow as the investigation developed. Cole Tomas Allen, teacher, game developer, Caltech graduate, 31 years old from Torrance, California, was going to face the full weight of the federal justice system. But the question that kept echoing through every newsroom, every federal briefing room, every dinner table conversation in America, that Sunday morning was not about charges or arraignment dates. It was simpler than that, and far more chilling. How had he gotten so close? It was the question that law enforcement officials, security experts, and ordinary Americans were turning over in their minds as Sunday morning broke across the country. The coffee was brewing, the news alerts were still pinging, and the footage, Wolf Blitzer being thrown to the ground, armed agents flooding the dais, Trump being swept off the stage, was playing on a loop across every major network. The Washington Hilton had been described, in the days leading up to the dinner, as operating under security conditions that rivaled a national security event. Massive interagency coordination, metal detector screening, Secret Service presence throughout the building. And yet a man with a shotgun, a handgun, and multiple knives had walked through that same building, checked into a room, bided his time, and then made his move at exactly the moment when the most powerful people in America were seated and distracted and celebrating. The answer, uncomfortable as it was, came down to one structural reality that no amount of planning had been able to eliminate. The Washington Hilton is a public hotel. Its lobby does not belong exclusively to the Secret Service or to the White House Correspondents Association. On any given night, ordinary people walk through it, tourists, business travelers, couples on weekend getaways. And on the night of April 25, 2026, Cole Tomas Allen had been one of those ordinary people. He had a room, he had a key, he had every right, on paper, to be exactly where he was. The security perimeter had been built around the ballroom, not around the building. That gap, a gap that security planners had acknowledged and attempted to mitigate, was the gap that Allen had walked through, and it raised questions that would outlast the news cycle by months, perhaps years. Questions about how you secure a semi-public venue when the threat is not a known actor approaching from outside, but a patient, calculating individual who has already positioned himself on the inside. Questions about whether the model of hosting events of this magnitude in hotels that remain open to the public is a model that can survive in a threat environment like this one. Former FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe, who had praised the security coordination before the event, was among those who would have to reconcile his confidence with what had actually unfolded. The system had worked, in the sense that the shooter was stopped before he reached the ballroom. The officer who was hit survived because of his vest. No one died. But the system had also allowed a man carrying 3 weapons to get close enough that Wolf Blitzer, one of the most recognizable faces in American journalism, could watch him fire 6 shots from just a few feet away. That is not a success story, that is a near miss, and near misses have a way of demanding accountability. Inside the investigation, the work was moving fast. FBI agents had spent the night in Torrance, processing the home linked to Allen, looking for anything that might explain what had driven a 31-year-old teacher and video game developer to travel across the country and attempt to kill members of the United States government. His hotel room at the Washington Hilton had been secured and was being searched. His digital footprint, his LinkedIn, his Facebook, his Steam gaming profile, his financial records was being reconstructed piece by piece. What they were building was not just a legal case, it was a portrait, the kind of portrait that investigators always have to construct in the aftermath of political violence, the kind that tries to answer the question the public always asks and that law enforcement is always reluctant to answer too quickly. Why? The $25 donation to a Kamala Harris PAC told part of a story, but nowhere near all of it. Political donations of that size are expressions of sentiment, not manifestos. Millions of Americans had donated similar amounts to similar causes without ever coming within 1,000 miles of contemplating violence. The donation placed Allen somewhere on the political spectrum. It did not explain him. What investigators were looking for went deeper. They were looking for the moment, or the series of moments when whatever Cole Tomas Allen was carrying inside him crossed the threshold from frustration or ideology or despair into action, into planning, into driving to a hardware store or a gun shop or wherever it was that a man acquires a shotgun and a handgun and multiple knives and begins to think of them not as weapons in the abstract, but as tools for a specific purpose on a specific night in a specific hotel in Washington, D.C. That threshold, the line between thinking and doing, is the thing that investigators of political violence spend their careers trying to understand. And in the case of Cole Tomas Allen, as of the morning after the shooting, no one had found it yet. The arraignment came on Monday. Allen appeared before a federal court, facing the charges that U.S. Attorney Gene Pirro had outlined on Saturday night, using a firearm during a crime of violence and assault on a federal officer using a dangerous weapon, with the explicit understanding that more charges were coming. His own words to law enforcement, the statement that he had been attempting to assassinate officials from the Trump administration, guaranteed that the legal proceedings ahead would be long, consequential, and closely watched. Outside the courthouse, the world was still processing. World leaders had weighed in over the weekend. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had posted that he and his wife were shocked by the attempted assassination of President Donald Trump. Other governments had issued statements of relief and condemnation. In Washington, lawmakers from both parties had spoken, some focusing on the security failure, some focusing on the political climate, some simply expressing the kind of grateful disbelief that accompanies any moment when something catastrophic almost happened but ultimately didn't. Trump himself had returned to Truth Social, as he always does, to process the night in real time. He had praised the Secret Service. He had shared photos of the subdued suspect. He had floated the idea of building a more secure White House ballroom, using the incident with characteristic instinct to make a broader point about infrastructure. And he had said, with the particular defiance that defines him, that the dinner would be rescheduled. That the evening would not be surrendered to the man who had tried to destroy it. The White House Correspondents Association had said the same. Weijia Jiang, who had stood on that stage twice in one night, once to announce the program would continue, and once to announce it was over, had found the words that the moment required. And on a night when we are thinking about the freedoms in the First Amendment, she said, we must also think about how fragile they are. Fragile. That word stayed with people, because what April 25, 2026 had exposed in 25 seconds of gunfire and chaos in the lobby of a Washington hotel was exactly that. The fragility of the systems we build to protect power. The fragility of the assumption that security, however elaborate, is impenetrable. The fragility of a Saturday evening that 2,600 people had arrived at expecting nothing more remarkable than good food, political gossip, and maybe a few memorable jokes. And there was another kind of fragility too, one less discussed, but no less real. The fragility of the distance between a grievance and a gun, between a man who wins Teacher of the Month and a man who checks into a hotel with a shotgun, between a Caltech engineer who builds indie video games and a suspect who tells federal investigators he came to Washington to kill. Cole Tomas Allen had not materialized from nowhere. He had lived a life. He had taught students. He had been recognized and rewarded and celebrated in small ways by the community around him. And somewhere inside that life, something had broken or hardened or twisted into a shape that none of his neighbors or colleagues or the people who gave him that Teacher of the Month award had recognized in time. That is, perhaps, the most disturbing part of this story, not the guns, not the proximity to the president, not even the 25 seconds themselves. It is the fact that Cole Tomas Allen, by every visible measure, looked just like everyone else. The dinner will be rescheduled. The investigation will continue. The charges will be prosecuted. The security protocols will be reviewed, revised, and reinforced. Washington will do what Washington always does. It will absorb the shock, hold the hearings, commission the reports, and eventually move on to the next crisis. But for the 2,600 people who dove under their tables that Saturday night, who chanted, "God bless America," with trembling voices in a darkened ballroom, who were escorted through side doors and service corridors and out into the Washington night, the memory will not be so easily rescheduled. They were there when 25 seconds tried to change history. And they will carry that with them for the rest of their lives.